I never imagined my brother would stoop so low, but when I found out he joined our HOA board specifically to force me out of the house my grandfather left me, I knew I was in for the fight of my life. My name is Marcus Chen, and I inherited my grandfather's beautiful colonial home in Newton, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. The house sat on 2 acres of pristine land with mature oak trees lining the driveway and a garden my grandmother had cultivated for 40 years before she passed. When Grandpa died 6 months ago, I thought the hardest part would be dealing with the grief. I was wrong. The hardest part was dealing with my older brother, Derek. Derek had always been the golden child in our family. He went to Harvard Business School, married a lawyer named Patricia, and made partner at his consulting firm by age 35. I took a different path. I became a high school teacher, never made 6 figures, and remained single by choice. Our grandfather loved us both, but he knew Derek already had money and success. When Grandpa revised his will 3 years before his death, he left the Newton house to me and split his financial assets between Derek and me equally. The house was worth about $800,000. Derek got $400,000 in cash and investments. I got $400,000 plus the house. Derek contested the will immediately. He hired expensive attorneys and claimed Grandpa lacked mental capacity when he made the changes. The case dragged through probate court for months, but ultimately the judge ruled in my favor. Grandpa had been examined by 2 doctors within weeks of updating his will, both confirming his complete mental clarity. The judge even noted that Grandpa had written detailed explanations for his decisions, showing clear reasoning and sound judgment. I moved into the house last September, exactly 2 weeks after the probate case concluded. The home sat in Chestnut Hill Estates, a planned community with about 200 houses, all built in the early 1990s. The HOA had always been relatively quiet during my childhood visits to see Grandpa. They collected dues, maintained the common areas, and organized the occasional community event. I paid my first quarterly dues of $300 without complaint and started settling into my new life. Then everything changed in November. I was grading papers on a Tuesday evening when someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find a woman in her late 40s with blonde highlights, aggressive makeup, and the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. She wore a pink blazer despite the cold weather and held a leather portfolio under one arm. "Hello, you must be Marcus," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Brenda Whitmore, president of the Chestnut Hill Estates HOA board. Welcome to the neighborhood." I shook her hand, noticing her grip was firmer than necessary. "Thanks, I actually grew up visiting this house, so I know the area pretty well." "Oh, how lovely." Her smile tightened. "I wanted to personally welcome you and also discuss a few items regarding your property." Something in her tone made my stomach sink. "What items?" Brenda opened her portfolio and pulled out several printed pages with photographs. "We've had some complaints from neighbors about the condition of your property. The paint on your shutters is peeling, your lawn has some bare patches, and your mailbox appears to be rusted." I stared at the photos, all clearly taken from the street in front of my house. "These are really minor issues. The house is 30 years old. The CC and Articus are very clear about property maintenance standards," Brenda said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "You have 30 days to address these violations or you'll face fines of $100 per day per violation." $100 per day? That seems excessive. "Those are the rules we all agreed to when we bought property here." She handed me the papers. "Everything is outlined in these notices. Have a wonderful evening, Marcus." She walked away before I could respond, her heels clicking on my driveway like gunshots. I closed the door and examined the violation notices. They were printed on official HOA letterhead and cited specific sections of the community guidelines. I pulled out my copy of the CC and Articus that Grandpa had kept in his files and started reading. The language was vague enough that the board could interpret almost anything as a violation, if they wanted to be difficult. Over the next 2 weeks, I painted the shutters, reseeded the lawn, and installed a new mailbox. The total cost came to about $800, money I had not budgeted for since I was still paying off legal fees from the probate case. I documented everything with photographs and timestamps, then submitted my compliance evidence to the HOA board through their online portal. 3 days later, I received another notice. This time, Brenda claimed my fence needed repairs, my driveway had cracks that required professional resurfacing, and my trees needed professional trimming because some branches extended over the property line into the common area. The estimated cost to fix everything exceeded $15,000. I called the HOA office and asked to speak with Brenda. The receptionist, a tired-sounding woman named Gloria, told me Brenda was unavailable but could schedule a meeting for the following week. I made an appointment for Tuesday at 6 in the evening. That weekend, I walked around the neighborhood looking at other properties. I counted at least 20 houses with conditions similar to or worse than mine. Peeling paint, cracked driveways, overgrown bushes, and rusted fixtures were everywhere. Yet according to Gloria, mine was the only property currently facing violation notices. The HOA office occupied a small building near the community pool and tennis courts. I arrived 10 minutes early for my meeting and found Brenda sitting behind a desk with 2 other board members flanking her. On the left sat a balding man in his 60s who introduced himself as Gerald Thompson, the treasurer. On the right sat a younger woman, maybe mid-30s, named Susan Park, the secretary, and standing against the back wall, arms crossed and wearing a smug expression, was my brother Derek. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Derek smiled. "Didn't you hear? I joined the HOA board last month. We had an opening for vice president, and since Patricia and I just bought a house in the neighborhood, I volunteered to serve the community." My blood went cold. "You bought a house here, 2 streets over," Derek said. "Beautiful 4-bedroom colonial. We close escrow next week, but the board was kind enough to let me start serving early since I'm already familiar with the community through Grandpa." I turned to Brenda. "This is a conflict of interest. He's my brother and we have a contentious relationship." Brenda's smile was pure ice. "Derek disclosed his relationship to you during the application process. The board voted unanimously to accept him. His business expertise will be invaluable as we work to maintain and improve property values in Chestnut Hill Estates." I felt trapped. This was not a coincidence. Derek had orchestrated this entire situation. He bought a house in the neighborhood specifically to join the board, and now he and Brenda were working together to make my life miserable. "Let's discuss your violations," Brenda said, opening a folder. "We've reviewed your compliance photos for the first set of issues. While you addressed the cosmetic items, our inspector noted that the quality of work was substandard." "Substandard how?" Gerald cleared his throat. "The paint on your shutters is already showing wear, suggesting you used exterior paint instead of the required marine-grade formula. Your lawn reseeding used a grass type that doesn't match the approved blend for our community. And your new mailbox, while rust-free, is not the correct style as specified in our design guidelines." I pulled out my phone and opened the CC&R document. "I don't see any specification for marine-grade paint, I don't see an approved grass blend, and I don't see mailbox-style requirements." Susan spoke for the first time, her voice soft but firm. "Those specifications are in the updated guidelines we published last month. Last month, I never received updated guidelines. They were posted on the community website and emailed to all residents," Brenda said. "I never got an email." Derek chimed in from the back. "Sounds like a personal email management issue, Marcus. We can't be held responsible if you don't read community communications." I wanted to leap across the desk and wipe that smirk off his face. Instead, I took a deep breath. "Fine. Send me the updated guidelines and I'll make any necessary corrections." Brenda slid a packet across the desk. "Here's a printed copy." As for the new violations regarding your fence, driveway, and trees, those are more serious infrastructure issues. Our inspector believes the fence poses a safety hazard. The driveway cracks could lead to drainage problems affecting neighboring properties, and the tree branches violate our clear zone requirements. I looked at other properties in this neighborhood, I said. Plenty of them have the same or worse conditions. Why am I being singled out? We address violations as they're reported, Brenda replied. If you're aware of other properties in violation, feel free to submit complaints through our online system. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Brenda and Derek tag-teaming to explain why every one of my objections was invalid. By the end, I had been given 60 days to complete $15,000 in repairs or face fines starting at $100 per day per violation, potentially reaching $300 per day total. If the fines went unpaid for 90 days, the HOA could place a lien on my property. I left the office feeling sick. This was Derek's plan. He couldn't take the house from me through the courts, so he joined the HOA to force me out through financial pressure. If I couldn't pay the fines, the lien would damage my credit and eventually could lead to foreclosure. Even if I sold the house to escape the situation, the violations would lower the property value, and Derek might be able to swoop in and buy it at a discount. When I got home, I called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh who had represented me during the probate case. I explained the situation while she listened without interrupting. "This is harassment," she said when I finished, "but proving it will be difficult. HOAs have broad authority to enforce their rules, even if the enforcement seems selective. What are my options?" "You could pay for the repairs and document everything, then sue for selective enforcement. You could try to get other homeowners to join you in challenging the board's authority. Or you could fight the violations individually and hope the board backs down. None of these options are quick or cheap." "I can't afford $15,000 right now. I'm still paying off your fees from probate," Jennifer sighed. "I know. Let me research Massachusetts HOA law and see if there are any creative solutions. In the meantime, document everything. Every interaction, every email, every notice. If this goes to court, we'll need a clear paper trail showing the harassment." Over the next week, I took Jennifer's advice. I photographed every house in the neighborhood, noting violations. I printed all my email correspondence with the HOA. I even drove to the town hall and pulled records on recent HOA board elections and rule changes. What I found was disturbing. Brenda had been HOA president for 3 years, during which time the violation notices had increased by 400%. 6 families had been forced to sell their homes after being unable to pay accumulated fines. The HOA's bank account had grown from $20,000 to over $200,000, primarily through violation fines and legal fees assessed to homeowners who challenged the board. I also found something interesting in the historical records. Grandpa had served on the HOA board 15 years ago, and during his tenure, he had pushed through amendments to the CC and Articles that specifically protected homeowners from excessive fines and arbitrary rule changes. Those amendments required a 2/3 vote of all residents to modify major provisions. Last year, Brenda had tried to remove those protections. The vote failed, but only barely, with 58% of residents voting against the changes. She needed 67% to win. I started talking to neighbors. Most were terrified of the HOA board and refused to speak on the record, but a few opened up after I explained my situation. A retired teacher named Margaret Liu had been fighting the board for 2 years over violations related to her flower garden. A young couple, James and Rachel Morrison, had received violations within weeks of buying their home, forcing them to spend thousands on repairs that their home inspector had not flagged as necessary. Brenda targets specific people, Margaret told me over coffee at her kitchen table. She doesn't like anyone who questions her authority. When I complained about the lack of transparency in the budget, suddenly I had violations. When James and Rachel voted against her proposed assessment increase, they got violations too. Why doesn't anyone run against her for the board? I asked. Margaret laughed bitterly. People have tried. Brenda controls the nomination process and the election rules. Last year, she disqualified 3 candidates on technicalities. The only people who make it onto the ballot are her supporters or people too naive to know what they're getting into. I thought about Derek. He was not naive. He knew exactly what he was doing by allying with Brenda. My 60-day deadline approached rapidly. I got quotes from contractors for the fence, driveway, and tree work. The cheapest bid came in at $14,000. I had maybe $5,000 in savings after paying legal fees. I could take out a home equity loan, but that would put me in debt and give Derek more leverage. Then I remembered something Grandpa had told me years ago. We were sitting on his back porch watching the sunset, and he mentioned that he had made special arrangements to protect the house. "I've seen what HOAs can become," he had said. "Power-hungry people making life miserable for their neighbors. I made sure this property has protections." At the time, I had not understood what he meant. Now, I wondered if there was something in his will or property documents that I had missed. I spent an entire Saturday going through every box in Grandpa's study. He had been meticulous about record keeping, filing away every document related to the house. I found the original purchase agreement from 1991, renovation permits from various projects, and decades of HOA correspondence. Then, in a file labeled Estate Planning, I found a letter addressed to me, dated 3 years ago, right around the time Grandpa had updated his will. "Dear Marcus," it began, "if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've inherited the house. I hope you'll be happy here, but I know there may be challenges ahead. Your brother has always been ambitious, sometimes to the point of ruthlessness. I've watched him become more like your father in that regard, and it worries me." My hands shook as I continued reading. "I've taken steps to protect this property from HOA overreach. When we first moved to Chestnut Hill Estates, the developer gave the first 10 homeowners special exemptions from certain CC and R provisions in exchange for buying before the community was fully built. Those exemptions were recorded as deed restrictions and run with the land permanently. They include protections against excessive fines, requirements for due process before any lien can be placed, and limits on what types of violations can be enforced." I nearly dropped the letter. Grandpa's property had deed restrictions that superseded the HOA rules. "The exemption documents should be in the blue folder in my filing cabinet," the letter continued. "Make copies and keep them safe. If the HOA ever gives you trouble, those deed restrictions are your shield." I also kept detailed records of every HOA violation notice issued in this neighborhood for the past 15 years. You'll find them useful if you need to prove selective enforcement. I found the blue folder right where Grandpa said it would be. Inside were the original deed restrictions, signed by the developer and recorded with the county. I read through the legal language carefully, my heart racing. The restrictions were even better than Grandpa had described. Any HOA fine against my property could not exceed $50 per violation per month. The HOA had to provide 90 days written notice before any lien could be considered. Most importantly, the HOA could not enforce cosmetic violations that were standard for properties of similar age in the community. I made copies of everything and sent the originals to Jennifer Walsh via overnight mail. Then I emailed Brenda and requested an emergency board meeting to discuss my violations. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I arrived with Jennifer, my documentation, and a laptop loaded with photos of every violation in the neighborhood. Derek was already there, sitting next to Brenda with that same smug expression. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I said, setting my laptop on the table. "I've reviewed the violations you've issued against my property, and I have some concerns about their validity." Brenda folded her hands. "We've been very patient with you, Marcus. Your 60-day deadline is approaching, and we've received no indication that you plan to complete the required repairs. Jennifer spoke up. My client has discovered that his property is subject to deed restrictions that were recorded when the community was first developed. Those restrictions supersede the HOA's CC and Articus, and significantly limit what violations can be enforced against his property. She slid copies of the deed restrictions across the table. Brenda's face went pale as she read them. Gerald and Susan exchanged worried glances. Derek's smug expression finally faltered. These deed restrictions haven't been enforced in years, Brenda said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. That doesn't make them invalid, Jennifer replied. They were properly recorded and run with the land. According to these documents, the maximum fine you can assess against Mr. Chen's property is $50 per month for all violations combined. The $15,000 in repairs you've demanded are primarily cosmetic issues affecting a 30-year-old property, which the deed restrictions explicitly protect. I opened my laptop. I've also documented 147 similar violations throughout the neighborhood that the HOA has not addressed. This proves selective enforcement. I clicked through photos showing peeling paint, cracked driveways, overgrown landscaping, and rusted fixtures on properties throughout Chestnut Hill Estates. Many were worse than the conditions at my house. Derek finally spoke. Those deed restrictions only applied to the first 10 properties. They were meant to expire after 20 years. Actually, they were meant to run with the land in perpetuity, Jennifer said. There's no sunset clause in the recorded documents. Perhaps you should have done your research before joining the board specifically to harass your brother. The room went silent. Susan looked uncomfortable. Gerald stared at the table. Brenda's jaw tightened. That's a serious accusation, Brenda said. Is it? I leaned forward. Derek bought a house in this neighborhood 1 month after losing his court case to steal my inheritance. He joined the HOA board immediately. Within weeks, I received violations that would cost me $15,000 to fix, potentially forcing me to sell the house he wanted. If that's not harassment, I don't know what is. Derek stood up. You have no proof of any conspiracy. I have plenty of proof, I said. I have records showing that this HOA has forced 6 families to sell their homes in the past 3 years through excessive fines. I have evidence that President Whitmore selectively enforces rules against people who challenge her authority. I have documentation that you, Derek, bought your house specifically to join this board. And now I have deed restrictions that make all your threats meaningless. Jennifer opened her briefcase. We're prepared to file suit against the HOA for harassment, selective enforcement, and violation of the recorded deed restrictions. We'll also be filing a complaint against Derek for abuse of his board position for personal gain. However, we're willing to discuss a settlement. Brenda found her voice again. What kind of settlement? First, all violations against Mr. Chen's property are withdrawn immediately. Second, the HOA acknowledges the validity of his deed restrictions in writing. Third, Derek resigns from the board and agrees not to run for any position again. Fourth, the HOA pays Mr. Chen's legal fees, which currently total $8,000. And fifth, the board agrees to a third-party audit of its violation enforcement practices over the past 3 years. That's absurd, Brenda said. We'll never agree to those terms. Jennifer smiled. Then we'll see you in court. I should mention that Massachusetts has strong laws against HOA abuse of power. If we win, and I'm confident we will, the court can remove the entire board, invalidate your violations against dozens of homeowners, and award treble damages for harassment. Your legal fees alone will drain the HOA's reserves and require a special assessment on every homeowner. I don't think your neighbors will appreciate that. I watched the board members process this information. Gerald looked sick. Susan kept glancing at the door like she wanted to run. Even Brenda seemed to deflate slightly. Derek tried one more time. This is blackmail. No, I said. This is justice. You tried to steal my inheritance through the courts and failed. Then you tried to steal it through the HOA and failed again. Now you're going to face the consequences." The meeting ended without a resolution, but I could tell we had rattled them. Jennifer advised me to expect a settlement offer within a week. She was right. 5 days later, Gloria from the HOA office called and asked me to come in to discuss a resolution. I arrived with Jennifer to find Brenda and Gerald waiting. Derek was noticeably absent. "We've discussed your proposed settlement," Brenda said, her voice tight. "We're prepared to accept most of your terms with some modifications." "We're listening," Jennifer said. "We'll withdraw all current violations against your property and acknowledge the deed restrictions. However, we can only pay $5,000 toward your legal fees, and we cannot agree to Derek's resignation because board members serve at the pleasure of the residents, not the board itself." "Not acceptable," Jennifer said immediately. "We need full legal fees and Derek's resignation." Gerald spoke up. "Derek has already submitted his resignation, effective immediately. He cited personal reasons. As for the legal fees, $5,000 is genuinely all we can pay without requiring a special assessment. Our reserves are lower than we'd like." I glanced at Jennifer, who nodded slightly. "What about the third-party audit?" Brenda sighed. "We'll agree to an audit, but we want to select the auditor from a list of qualified firms. We'll each select 2 firms, and those 4 firms will recommend a 5th, Jennifer countered. "That ensures impartiality." After another hour of negotiation, we reached an agreement. The HOA would withdraw all violations, acknowledge my deed restrictions, pay $5,000 in legal fees, and submit to a third-party audit. Derek had resigned. Brenda agreed to implement new policies requiring board approval for any violation fine exceeding $100 total, and allowing homeowners to appeal violations to an independent arbitrator. I signed the settlement agreement 2 weeks later. The HOA sent me a formal letter acknowledging that my property was subject to deed restrictions that limited their enforcement authority. They also sent a check for $5,000. Derek never contacted me directly, but I heard through family members that he and Patricia had decided not to move to Chestnut Hill Estates after all. They sold the house before closing and bought something in Brookline instead. My parents were furious with Derek when they learned what he had done. My mother stopped speaking to him for 3 months, and my father cut him out of his own will. The third-party audit revealed serious problems with the HOA's violation enforcement. The auditor found that Brenda had issued violations against 23 families who had either challenged her authority or voted against her proposals. The pattern was unmistakable. The auditor also discovered that Brenda had been paying herself consulting fees of $2,000 per month from HOA funds without proper board approval. The residents called for a special election. Brenda, Gerald, and Susan were all removed from the board. New elections brought in Margaret Liu as president, along with 4 other reform-minded board members. One of their first acts was to refund excessive fines to homeowners who had been targeted by the previous board. I finally felt like I could breathe in my own home. The holidays came and went peacefully. I decorated the house the way Grandpa used to, with lights along the roofline and a wreath on the door. Several neighbors stopped by to thank me for standing up to the old board. In January, I received a letter from a law firm in Boston. My stomach dropped, thinking Derek had found some new way to attack me. Instead, the letter informed me that the Massachusetts Attorney General's office had opened an investigation into Brenda Whitmore for embezzlement of HOA funds. They were requesting my testimony as a witness. I met with an assistant attorney general named Kevin Park in February. He explained that after our audit became public, 2 other HOAs in Massachusetts came forward with complaints about companies Brenda had recommended for community repairs. Those companies were overcharging HOAs and kicking back portions of the fees to Brenda. We're looking at potential fraud charges involving multiple HOAs and several $100,000, Kevin said. Your case was relatively minor in the scope of what she was doing, but your audit helped break the case open. I provided my testimony, along with all my documentation. The case moved quickly by legal standards. By April, Brenda was arrested and charged with 15 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. The local news covered the story extensively. Several residents from other HOAs contacted me to thank me for exposing her. Brenda's trial took place in October. I attended several days of testimony, watching as prosecutors laid out a scheme that had been running for 5 years. She had created fake companies, approved inflated repair contracts, and pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars from multiple HOAs. She had also manipulated violation enforcement to pressure homeowners into selling properties that her associates could then buy at below-market prices. Derek's name came up during the trial. Prosecutors revealed that Brenda had contacted him after learning about our probate dispute. She had offered to help him get the house if he joined the board, and they worked together. Derek had agreed, not knowing the full extent of her criminal operation. Derek was not charged with any crimes because he had not been involved in the financial fraud, but his reputation was destroyed. His firm asked him to resign. Patricia filed for divorce. He ended up moving to California to start over. The jury found Brenda guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 6 years in prison and ordered her to pay full restitution to all the HOAs she had defrauded. She was also banned from serving on any HOA board in Massachusetts for life. As for me, life returned to normal. I continued teaching, spent my summers renovating the house, and got involved in the new HOA board as an advisor. Margaret was an excellent president, running the HOA the way it should be run, focusing on genuine community needs rather than petty enforcement. I planted new trees in the backyard that spring, the same type Grandma had loved. I hosted a big family gathering for Thanksgiving, the first time the whole family had been together since Grandpa's funeral. Derek was not invited, but everyone else came. My parents apologized for not seeing sooner what Derek was doing. I forgave them because holding grudges only poisons your own life. One evening in December, I sat on the back porch wrapped in a blanket, watching snow fall on the garden. I thought about Grandpa and how he had protected me even after his death. The deed restrictions, the detailed records, the letter explaining everything he had known, I might need those tools to defend myself. I pulled out my phone and opened the Photos app, scrolling to a picture of Grandpa and me from 5 years ago. We were standing in this same spot, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. "Thank you," I whispered to the photo, "for everything." The house was finally mine, truly and completely. No one could take it from me now. I had fought for it, defended it, and earned the right to call it home. More importantly, I had learned that standing up to bullies, whether they're family members or HOA tyrants, was always worth the effort. I thought about all the families who had been hurt by Brenda's schemes and felt grateful that we had stopped her before she could damage more lives. The restitution she was required to pay would help those families recover financially. The reforms we implemented would protect future residents from similar abuse. As I sat there in the falling snow, I felt a profound sense of peace. This house, this neighborhood, this community, they were all better because people had been willing to fight for what was right. Grandpa had taught me that through his actions and his planning. Derek had tried to teach me that might makes right, but he was wrong. Justice makes right. Truth makes right. Standing firm in the face of corruption and intimidation makes right. I went back inside, made myself a cup of tea, and sat down to grade papers. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the neighborhood in a blanket of white. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students to teach, new projects around the house. But tonight, I was content to simply exist in this space my grandparents had built and my grandfather had protected. The legal bills were paid. The violations were gone. The corrupt board was disbanded. Brenda was in prison. Derek was in California, hopefully learning to be a better person. And I was home, exactly where I belonged. In the spring, I started dating someone I met at a community garden event. Her name was Lisa, and she taught art at the middle school across town from where I worked. She loved the house immediately, especially the garden and the big windows in the living room that let in afternoon light. "This place has good energy," she said the first time I brought her over for dinner. "You can tell people were happy here." She was right. Grandpa and Grandma had been happy here for over 20 years. Now I was happy here too, building a new life while honoring their memory. One Saturday in June, Margaret knocked on my door with news. The HOA had received an inquiry from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to make a short film about how our community had overcome corruption. They wanted to interview several residents, including me. "I think it's a good opportunity to show other people that they don't have to tolerate HOA abuse," Margaret said. "What do you think?" I agreed to participate. The filmmaker, a young woman named Sarah Chen, no relation, spent 3 days interviewing residents and filming the neighborhood. The resulting documentary, titled The HOA Trap, premiered at a local film festival in September and later aired on a regional PBS station. The response was overwhelming. I received dozens of emails from people across the country dealing with similar HOA issues. Some were facing selective enforcement. Others were fighting corrupt boards. A few were defending deed restrictions or easements that their HOAs were trying to ignore. Jennifer and I created a simple guide for homeowners dealing with HOA disputes. We outlined the steps we had taken, the documents we had gathered, and the legal strategies we had employed. We made it available for free online. Within a year, over 10,000 people had downloaded it. I never expected to become an advocate for HOA reform, but life takes unexpected turns. Teaching had prepared me well for explaining complex topics in accessible ways. My experience with Derek and Brenda had given me first-hand knowledge of how HOA abuse works and how to fight it. 2 years after the initial confrontation, I was invited to speak at the Massachusetts State House about proposed legislation to reform HOA governance. I stood in the hearing room, looking out at legislators and other advocates, and told my story. I explained how my grandfather's foresight and documentation had saved my home. I described how Brenda had exploited her power for personal gain. I detailed how Derek had tried to use the HOA as a weapon after failing in court. The committee listened intently. Several legislators asked questions about deed restrictions, selective enforcement, and financial oversight. 6 months later, Massachusetts passed new laws requiring HOAs to follow strict financial reporting rules, limiting fine amounts, providing due process for homeowners, and creating an appeals process through the state attorney general's office. It was not a perfect solution, but it was progress. Other states started looking at Massachusetts as a model for their own reforms. I continued teaching full-time but spent evenings and weekends helping homeowners navigate HOA disputes. Derek and I never reconciled. He sent me an email once, about 3 years after everything happened, saying he was sorry and asking if we could talk. I thought about it for a long time before responding. Eventually, I wrote back that I forgave him but was not ready to have a relationship. Too much had happened. Trust, once broken so thoroughly, could not be easily repaired. My parents understood. They maintained minimal contact with Derek, mostly because he was still their son, but the family dynamics had permanently changed. Some betrayals leave scars that never fully heal. Lisa and I got engaged 4 years after Grandpa passed. We planned a small wedding in the backyard, under the oak trees with close friends and family. As we exchanged vows, I thought about how much had changed since that day I inherited the house. I had expected peace, and instead found conflict. But through that conflict, I had discovered strength I did not know I possessed, The night before the wedding, I went into Grandpa's study, which I had kept mostly unchanged. I sat at his desk and pulled out the letter he had written me. "I hope I made you proud," I said to the empty room. "I fought for this house the way you would have wanted, and I'm going to fill it with love and laughter, just like you and Grandma did." I could almost hear his voice responding, that gentle rumble with a hint of amusement. "You did good, Marcus, you did real good." The wedding was perfect. Margaret gave a toast about community and resilience. Jennifer came with her husband and made everyone laugh with stories about our legal battles. Lisa's family welcomed me warmly, having heard all the stories about the house and what it represented. We danced under string lights as the sun set, surrounded by people who had supported me through the darkest times. The house stood behind us, solid and permanent, a testament to family legacy and the importance of planning ahead. In the years that followed, Lisa and I made the house our own while respecting its history. We renovated the kitchen but kept Grandma's original blue tiles as a backsplash. We converted one bedroom into an art studio for Lisa and another into a home office where I could grade papers and work on HOA advocacy projects. We had 2 kids, a daughter named Grace and a son named Henry. I told them stories about their great-grandfather and how he had protected this house for them before they were even born. I showed them the deed restrictions and explained why documentation matters. I taught them that standing up for what's right sometimes requires sacrifice and courage. Grace grew up to be a lawyer, inspired by the stories of how Jennifer had helped us fight the HOA. Henry became a teacher like me, finding joy in helping young people discover their potential. Both of them understood the value of home, family, and fighting for what matters. The neighborhood continued to thrive under good HOA management. Margaret served as president for 6 years before passing the role to James Morrison, who had learned from watching her lead with integrity. Property values increased steadily. Families stayed for decades rather than being driven out by excessive fines and harassment. I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I had not found Grandpa's letter and the deed restrictions. Would I have been forced to sell? Would Derek have gotten the house after all? Would Brenda's fraud have continued unchecked, hurting more families? But those were hypotheticals. In reality, I had found the tools I needed. I had fought the fight that needed fighting. And I had won not just for myself, but for an entire community that had been suffering under corrupt leadership. On the 10th anniversary of Grandpa's death, I organized a community garden day in his honor. 50 neighbors showed up to help plant flowers, trim hedges, and mulch pathways. We worked together in the sunshine, sharing stories and laughter. At the end of the day, we gathered for a barbecue in the common area. I stood up to say a few words, looking around at all these faces that had become familiar and dear over the years. "My grandfather believed in community," I said. "He believed that when people work together and look out for each other, amazing things can happen. He also believed that we have to stand up to bullies and fight corruption wherever we find it. This neighborhood embodies both of those beliefs." "Thank you for being the kind of community he would have been proud of." People clapped and cheered. Margaret hugged me. Lisa squeezed my hand. The kids ran around with other children playing tag in the fading light. That night I walked through the house, room by room, remembering. The living room where Grandpa used to read the newspaper. The kitchen where Grandma baked cookies. The study where he had carefully filed away documents that would eventually save my home. The bedrooms where my children now slept peacefully. Every room held memories, both old and new. The house was a living thing, breathing with the presence of everyone who had loved it. It was more than wood and brick and glass. It was legacy and hope and home. I walked out to the back porch and sat in the same spot where I had sat that snowy December night years ago. The air was warm now, full of summer sounds. Crickets chirped in the grass. Lightning bugs flickered in the darkness. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then fell silent. This was what Grandpa had wanted for me. Not just a house, but a home. Not just property, but peace. Not just inheritance, but independence and security. Derek had tried to take it from me, motivated by greed and jealousy. Brenda had tried to take it from me, motivated by corruption and control. But they had both failed because Grandpa had been smarter and more prepared than either of them anticipated. The years passed. Grace got married and bought a house 2 towns over. Henry traveled the world before settling in Vermont. Lisa and I grew older together, watching the seasons change from our back porch, tending the garden, hosting holidays, and making memories. I retired from teaching at 65, having spent 40 years helping young people learn to think critically and stand up for themselves. My last lecture included the story of fighting the HOA, using it as an example of how research, documentation, and persistence can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The students listened with rapt attention. Several came up afterward to thank me and ask questions. One young woman said, "My family is dealing with HOA problems right now. Can you help us?" I gave her Jennifer's contact information and my email address. "Document everything," I told her, "and don't let them intimidate you. HOAs have power, but they don't have absolute power. There are always ways to fight back if you're willing to do the work." She thanked me with tears in her eyes. A month later, I received an email saying her family's violations had been withdrawn after they presented evidence of selective enforcement and hired a lawyer to review their CC and Articus. These small victories added up. Every family that successfully challenged an abusive HOA made it easier for the next family to do the same. The culture was slowly changing, moving away from tyrannical boards and toward genuine community governance. I continued my advocacy work well into retirement, consulting with homeowners and occasionally testifying in court cases. Jennifer and I remained close friends, collaborating on several high-profile HOA reform cases. We won most of them, setting precedents that protected homeowners across Massachusetts and beyond. On my 70th birthday, the family gathered at the house for a big celebration. Grace brought her 3 kids. Henry brought his partner, a musician named Jordan. Lisa's siblings came with their families. My parents, both in their 90s now, sat in places of honor. Derek did not come. He had never been invited to family gatherings after what he did. I heard through distant relatives that he had rebuilt his career in California and remarried, but we had no direct contact. Some bridges once burned stay burned. As I looked around at all these people in my home, I felt overwhelming gratitude. This house had been a battleground once, but it was a sanctuary now. It had been threatened with loss, but it had been defended and preserved. It was exactly what Grandpa intended it to be, a gathering place for family, a symbol of legacy, and a reminder that love and preparation can outlast greed and corruption. Late that night, after everyone had left or gone to bed, I sat once more on the back porch. Lisa joined me, wrapping a blanket around both our shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything," I said. "The fight with Derek and the HOA, finding Grandpa's letter, the trial, the documentary, all the families we've helped over the years. How one decision he made, one set of documents he filed, changed everything." Lisa rested her head on my shoulder. "He knew what he was doing. He knew you'd need protection, and he made sure you had it. I wish I could thank him." "You do thank him. Every day you live here, every family you help, every time you tell his story. That's how we thank the people who came before us. We honor their memory by living well and helping others." She was right, as usual. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. Somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was playing music. A child laughed. A car door closed. Life went on, as it always does. The house stood solid around us, sheltering us from the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. But tonight, we had this moment of peace. And that was everything.